Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the news of the day, and that is Donald Trump's impeachment. It was at least moved past now that vote in the House of Representatives, which has overwhelmingly voted to impeach Donald Trump on those two specific articles of impeachment. He's now only the third president to be impeached. We know, of course, the next step is a Senate hearing. It is quite unlikely that the Senate, which is controlled by Republicans at this point in time, which is the party of President Donald Trump, will work to actually convict him for the articles of impeachment that have been put forth by the Democrats. Now, there's a lot of course, partisan bickering happening and has always happened throughout this process. Donald Trump is, of course, rejecting this entire process as a witch hunt, as are many Republicans. Democrats are saying this is about rule of law and holding even a sitting U.S. president to account. Let's discuss all of this a bit further. We're joined now by Sascha, Auerbach, who is a lecturer in history at the University of Nottingham. He's joining us now from London. Joining us from Brisbane in Australia is Frank Moles, who is senior lecturer in political science at the University of Queensland. He's also an expert in populism, Trump, and of course, a variety of other sectors and subjects as well. And we're also joined from Washington, D.C. by Mr. Michael Lane, who is the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. Michael, Sascha, and Frank, thank you all for your time today. Sascha, let me start with you. What do you make of the fact that the House did vote as it did? Of course, there's no surprise there, but what does this now mean going forward in the Senate?
Well, it makes for fantastic political theater, but unfortunately, I think it's going to have very little impact on the election. The vote was along party lines. The Senate, having a Republican majority, is the one that actually has to convict, and they will. There's absolutely no indication that they will not acquit. They're not going to get the 2/3 majority. It had to be done, and I think from someone who's observed American politics for a long time and also studies the functioning of law in American society, it was done in a very procedurally appropriate and valid fashion. But the Republicans have completely aligned themselves with Trump. They are the party of Trump now. So this is a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing.
Frank, what do you make of this? Because BC, as you know, the Republicans would say this has been a witch hunt from day one, that it's just been about getting Donald Trump somehow.
Yeah, I think it's right that it had to be done. It had due process had to be followed, as the previous speaker said. I think it's very interesting to see that the Democrat Party is actually quite torn by this whole issue, because of course it doesn't really translate into any electoral gains, and I think that's quite clear that the Democrats are, on the one hand, having to pursue with this because it's due process and they cannot not do this. But on the other hand, it's quite clear from both the voting in Congress as well as the public sentiment out there that there's no gains to be made, that everyone is still standing firm on their political ground. So in a sense, the Democrats wanted almost to get it now over with so that they can actually say, we've done it. It's still something we can appeal to over the course of the next few months and year.
Right.
But knowing that it really doesn't translate into any electoral gains.
Michael, what do you make of that? Do you think that possible Democrats have overstepped in this regard, or did they need to do this to have a president respect the laws of the land, regardless of whether they win or not in 2020?
Well, I think overstepping is the conventional wisdom here in the States. It shows the disconnect really between the two parties. There's not a single Republican in the country that understands this, that understands why it was done, that understood the need for it, that understands where are the crimes. There were actually in the articles of impeachment no crimes alleged at all. And Republicans are just betwixt and between, like, what is going on here? This is surreal. On the other hand, the Democrats are looking at it like, how can Republicans be so stupid? Why don't they get this? Why don't they understand? This is so obvious. So it is a complete and total disconnect here in the States. But one thing I think that was the real news that came out of last night, not the vote to impeach, because that was pre-scripted and preordained. But the big news that came out was that Speaker Pelosi is now refusing to send the articles of impeachment over to the Senate. until she is satisfied that there is a reasonable process and rules in place for conducting a trial. Well, memo to Speaker Pelosi. She runs the House, not the Senate. I suspect Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader's attitude is going to be, well, if she's not going to send us the articles of impeachment, there are other things we can work on, such as confirming Trump judges.
Indeed. And I wonder what you make of that, Sascha. Because Pelosi and Democrats, refusal right now to send this immediately to the Senate certainly raises some eyebrows, doesn't it?
It does, but I mean, she's responding to the announcement by Mitch McConnell and other Republicans that they are not going to treat these articles seriously and that they are not going to have a proper trial, which is mandated by the Constitution. I think what we've seen all throughout this, and I think this is where folks who step back from it and try to analyze it in a relatively objective fashion would all be in the same line, is you have seen the Democrats step by step following the legal mandate they were given, impeaching Trump for absolutely valid actions, mostly using his presidential authority to advance his political career. In fact, it's considered a high crime and misdemeanor to use any aspect of your executive power for personal gain, be it financial or political. And then all along at the same time, you've seen Republicans not mounting any substantive argument against those charges, but simply faulting them along procedural lines, saying, well, you have to show the whistleblower, and making a lot of very specious comparisons between the actual processes of impeachment and a kind of platonic ideal of what a legal trial in America should look like. And that's where I think the Democrats have the edge, and historians will actually judge them that way.
All right, so then on that point then, Frank, I wonder, I think the Republicans should actually have a long, drawn-out trial in the Senate, because there seems to be two views within the Republicans about that. Donald Trump seems to want a long, drawn-out show in the Senate where the whistleblower, too, would be forced to come in, and others as well, including possibly even Hunter Biden. Or on the other side, Mitch McConnell wants something that's just quickly done with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this will all be imbued by a sense of what is working electorally, what will work in terms of getting less and less attention for this over time, because as we know from other political events currently unfolding in the world, there's only so much time that the voters and the electorate can actually pay attention. There's a certain fatigue that will kick in. So I think the long drawn-out process will probably be quite strategically playing well for the Republicans, because it simply means that the fatigue will kick in and people will hear about the impeachment process every night, and will at some point psychologically turn off. And this is probably exactly what Donald Trump would want. So I think that's the interesting thing here, that the complete alignment along partisan lines here, which is the first time in American history, I understand, that has happened. If we talk about the impeachment of Bill Clinton, there was much more individual conscientious voting and people taking a stance on personal considerations. Here, for the first time in history, we see an absolute pure alignment along partisan lines. And I think that this makes it a partisan position, this makes it a partisan issue, this makes it something that will be used in a partisan way in Senate.
So then, Michael, we pretty much are back to square one, aren't we? Where there was a divided country when Donald Trump became president. It's become ever more divided throughout his presidency, and I'm not blaming either side. I mean, it's just what's happened, and we can obviously pick sides to blame. But do you think that going forward, this divide will become ever more obvious if there is a drawn-out Senate hearing?
Well, I think we're likely to become more divided regardless. And to address your reference to, but not a conclusion or a comment on which side is at fault or which side started this or whatever, I think there's more than enough blame to go around. Certainly, one of the characteristics of President Trump is that he came to Washington to really, drain the swamp, in his words. And that means a lot of the powerful interests that reside in Washington get the power drained out of them, and they're not reacting well to that. And when they react not well to it, they react in ways that really discredit themselves. So there's more than enough blame to go around. I'd like to comment on one thing one of my colleagues said, which was that this should be a a quintessential example of a judicial trial in the United States. I have to disagree with that. This is not a judicial trial. It's not a judicial proceeding. It's in the United States Senate, and it's a political trial. And so therefore, making it a stellar model of what a judicial trial should look like is not the case. The Mitch McConnell has floated using the 1999 rules exactly verbatim that were used in the Bill Clinton impeachment trial, and the Democrats have brushed that away, saying, "Oh no, those rules were fair then, but not fair now." Well, why not?
Sascha, what do you make of that? Do you think that the same rules should be applied now? And secondly, this is really, if we're completely honest with ourselves, more political show than anything else, isn't it?
No, I'm sorry. I think Michael misunderstood me. I said the argument the Republicans are making and that you heard them making yesterday was certain rules of evidence were not followed, witnesses were not called, in any other trial. They are trying to discredit the impeachment process by saying it should function as a quintessential trial. And I was saying no, absolutely not. The impeachment process is something entirely different. Now, in terms of how this works into electoral politics, which is something that another speaker talked about, the one thing we should keep in mind, and this is where the Democrats are gaining an advantage, is that as long as American attention is focused on this, it is not focused on the issue that Trump and his team wants them to be focused on, which is the economy.
But then, Sascha, if I may push you on that, doesn't this actually work in Trump's favor? Because, for lack of a better word, this makes him a martyr, doesn't it? Within his base, where he's like fighting off, he's already fought off in his mind, at least, a Russia collusion case, and now he's fought off, quote unquote, impeachment as well.
It's not really, though, because it takes a lot of energy and time from the executive. Their lawyers have to be going full speed to try to fend off these various subpoenas. Everyone who was allied with Trump has to consider, okay, what is the price of this alignment? Because Trump might not be convicted, but there are convictions being handed down as part of these investigation process. People have already gone to jail over this, and more will probably go to jail as the fallout from this. And one thing Trump has shown is that he has absolutely no loyalty whatsoever towards those, no matter what sacrifices they make for him. The next person who's probably up on the chopping block is going to be Giuliani. So, no, I don't think this works to his advantage. And we're also already at maximum voter mobilization. There's no evidence that this is either going to drive people to the polls or away from the polls.
Frank, do you think at some level that all of this will come into impeachment fatigue, right? We've spoken about Brexit fatigue in the UK, for example, but do you think at some level, with all this impeachment talk right before the elections that are coming up in 2020, that this might actually turn off voters more than anything else?
That is a good chance. There's a good chance that will happen. But I think the previous speaker made a good point that indeed one way to look at it is as long as the attention is on this process, there might be no attention for the economy, right? Because Trump can boast that the economy is roaring and that employment levels are low and so forth. So indeed, that would be a kind of incentive for the Democrats to keep this, for them to keep it drawn out. But I think in terms of electoral politics, we see indeed that it either turns off, but any people turning out to the voting booth will actually already have made up their mind, right? So in a sense, we're now in an era of what you could call Teflon politicians. Everything washes off their back. It's like water off a duck's back, as we say, where people have already committed to becoming a Trump supporter or a Pelosi supporter, whoever it may be, and that really informs how they view this whole process. So that's why we don't see any shifts, right? So this is all wishful thinking on the part of people who are very steeped in party politics, that, now we have the smoking gun, or now we have the final trip up by candidate A or B, and this will open people's minds or open people's eyes. And that's simply not borne out by the evidence. Hence, we see such very stable patterns in voting.
All right, so then who's really gaining from all this, I wonder? Because you would think that this sort of impeachment process would stain a president's legacy, right? But it doesn't seem to be completely that way when it comes to Donald Trump, because for better or worse, he's stood through a lot of these attacks, right? I mentioned Russia collusion already, and he's really been under attack from day one of his presidency, whether you like the man or not. That's just the reality on the ground. Do you think that the dynamics almost in American politics have changed significantly, where at one point in time impeaching a president in this fashion would have really stained his or her legacy, but now isn't necessarily the case?
actually changed a while ago. You correctly point out this is a stain that decades ago would have been a real problem. But Bill Clinton easily survived impeachment. I think he set the precedent. It is likely, although not ordained, that Donald Trump will survive impeachment. We'll find out who the real winners and losers are in about 10 months on Election Day of 2020. But right now, the polls are indicating there's been no movement on Democrats or Republicans. Democrats are unified in their dislike and impeachment of Trump. Republicans are unified in their opposition to impeachment. But the polls do show significant movement among the few people in America who are independents, and they are currently polling at about 68% opposed to impeachment. If Trump can harness and mobilize that, I think he cruises to re-election, particularly with the help of the independents in the battleground states such as Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Florida. But if Trump can't harness that, then he might be a one-term president. We're not going to know really where this race is until the Democrats have a nominee, which will come sometime next summer, midsummer.
Sascha, the question on many minds, and I know that a lot of Republicans have asked this, is that, listen, if you have a problem with Trump's policies, why not wait to fight this out in the elections themselves? Why make this an issue as it has been played out now vis-a-vis impeachment or otherwise?
I think that's a very good question. And I think the simple answer was that, I mean, Pelosi really put it, this is a matter of some urgency. We have a president who is violating the law, who is undermining American interests for his own benefit. And in those circumstances, political leaders with any sense of integrity and ethics are compelled to act. And one thing we haven't really talked about, and I think the real damage done here, is how the actions of Republicans have really made clear the complete ethical and moral degradation of that party. This is a party that used to stand for fiscal accountability, that used to stand for limited government, that used to stand for making the U.S. a strong and positive international presence. And it has simply thrown all of those ideals and practices into the rubbish bin to become full-out supporters of a populist demagogue with no moral integrity whatsoever.
But then the same can be said, it's a frank candidate for the Democrats, right? Because they're throwing everything they can at Donald Trump, but the people aren't connecting with that message. That's disturbing, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that much is, of course, remains to be seen in terms of who the candidate will become for the Democrats, and that will be next summer. I think until then, it's sort of a moving target, right? Because the unity in the Democrat base is almost a unity in hatred or in dislike of Trump and his followers, rather than a unity around another candidate and what a policy platform that offers a clear alternative. So I think that's the interesting thing as well, that we perhaps not talk about sufficiently. But the other thing I was going to say is, there's of course a parallel here with what the previous speaker says and the politics in the United Kingdom at the moment, where people are looking in disbelief at the number of times Boris Johnson gets caught out for twisting the truth or not telling the truth or telling outright lies, and still not seeing any decline in support for him, right? So we are in this different era of what I earlier called Teflon politicians, where nothing really sticks anymore, right? And my sense, too, is that this is something more recent, maybe not as recent as Trump and Brexit, but at least indeed the Clinton era where similar things started to happen.
So I wonder then, how does one move beyond this, even beyond the 2020 elections, however they work out? How does one bridge the gap within the people, within society, really? Because it seems that the rhetoric is becoming that much more hateful, not just amongst politicians, but it seems that that's the way it's working out even just amongst the people, where you have rallies that, both pro and counter rallies in some places in the U.S., which become significantly violent sometimes.
Yeah, it is dividing the country, and it's very sad. I mean, I monitor it not by what's going on at rallies, but just by reading my Facebook feed, and the absolute over-the-top, strident, vitriolic things that I read on Facebook are disappointing and even surprising. People are just 110% invested in beating their points so much, and it has gotten to the point where we don't get along with each other anymore. It's impossible to have a conversation. Romantic couples are breaking up because they're on opposite sides of the political divide. It's bad for America. How do we get past this? I don't know. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. I suspect that we are in for a longer rather than a shorter period of this kind of division. And it becomes difficult for one side or the other to tone it down and extend the olive branch and get together, because this kind of stuff works for motivating your base. And the first side that says, OK, let's play nice, is the side that's going to lose. Yeah.
And on that point, then, Sascha, that Tulsi Gabbard, the American politician, she voted present, I believe, when it came to this motion in the House about these articles of impeachment. And she's been bashed by the Democrats and the Republicans both, of course, from day one. But do you think that sort of goes to show once again that it's just become such a divisive issue and so hateful almost on both sides? This simply cannot be healthy, whichever side you stand on, where, as Michael there said, family members now don't speak to each other because they have differences over whether they support Trump or not, et cetera. That's not a way to move forward, certainly in a mature fashion about these things.
Well, I think you have to actually look back to the Obama era, which was a real watershed moment in American politics. I mean, the election of the first African-American president. And that is actually when you first started to see this incredibly vitriolic speech come out. And let's not forget that one of the origins of that speech was Donald Trump himself. And I think it's unfair, really, to hold both sides equally accountable for this. I mean, Obama, whether you agreed with his policies or not, was a moral person. He was a person of very rational, moderate politics in many ways. He was not liberal enough for a lot of liberals in America. And it was really under his presidency that this vitriol started to accumulate through Fox News, through the speeches of men like Trump, through Obama's political opponents. And they were really playing on voters' emotional capacity and saying, this man is a Muslim, this man is a traitor. And you start to hear this language coming out of the Republican side that the Democrats are traitors. So I don't think it's really going to be on the Republicans to recover their moral center, to step back from this politics of division. If they're the ones that started it, they, I think, now own it. And the ethical onus is on them to change the course of American politics now.
So, Frank, certainly not just a phenomenon that is limited to the United States. This is happening around the world. As you had pointed out, of course, there's an example coming out of the UK. Even in Australia, I would imagine, some level, there are divisive politics playing out there, too. Do you think that this is now a growing phenomenon worldwide, where it's dividing even societies within themselves along partisan lines?
Yeah, definitely. I think in Australia we see similar things, and it focuses here on things like climate change, where the dividing lines become sharper and sharper, and where there's more extreme positions on both sides of politics. But having studied in multiple countries and different governance systems, most of us in political science would typically teach our students by saying, listen, there's different systems of government, there's proportional representation systems, and winner takes it all, and all the variant of that. And most of us would have taught our students to say that, well, there's benefits and pros and cons on each side of that divide as well. There's no single system that's better than another. It has advantages and disadvantages. But I'm growing towards the view that proportional representation systems offer slightly more an immunity to that kind of toxic politics, but also more scope for coming back, for restoration, right? Because there's simply more players in the game. The party can come up more easily in that system, saying, listen, we need a different politics, we need to set aside our differences. So I think what we're witnessing is particularly a problem in the Anglosphere, right? With countries with two-party systems, or Westminster or Washminster or whatever model we will call it, is the system that we've accepted as a reality. So if you talk about various European countries have, for example, switched from Labour to Conservative over the last few years in very unpredictable ways. There's countries where new parties have sprouted up that have suddenly been able to offer a fresh perspective. New Zealand has recently had a Labour government voted in with Lucinda Ardern, who is very inspirational. So I think that increasingly what we're seeing is a problem that is quite unique to the Anglosphere. And I suspect that sooner or later people will start asking that question: is this a system that works for us, or is this divisive politics somehow keeping the electorate on the front lines in the what do you call it, in the in the trenches with their warfare? Meanwhile, of course, the vested interests, to use that slightly awkward language, are continuing business as usual, right? The multinationals that we have problems with that we would like to change their tax are carrying on business as usual as the populace is fighting in the trenches. And again, and I'd be keen to hear the other speakers' views about that. Is this something that we need to worry about in the Anglo-Saxon world more than in countries where we have proportional representation, where we have systems that can somewhat rejuvenate themselves from within?
All right, so Michael, I'll give you the final word. Do you think that in some ways this is a judgment on just American political establishment, this sort of divisiveness, and does that need to be revisited in some fashion, which isn't this unhealthy? Because at some level, sometimes it feels, Michael, that the American people are just pawns.
Well, I think the key thing of what Frank said was that no system is perfect. They all have advantages and disadvantages. We are going through a phase now of undetermined length, but fairly intense, where the systems that we have in the Anglosphere are less efficient, less effective than they have been over the course of history. But I think over the course of history, the United States model of government has been tremendously effective, more so than any other system at all. And it's important that we get back on track. It's important that we figure out how to get along with each other, how to compromise. But over the last 250 years, I will take the United States form of government over anything else that's been on the planet in history.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that. But of course, we appreciate Sascha, Frank, and Michael for their time and their insight today. Donald Trump, of course, that vote to impeach him has gone through in the House of Representatives. The next major hurdle is to wait, of course, for Nancy Pelosi to even send that impeachment vote to the Senate for the Senate hearing process to then begin. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, is saying at this point in time that he simply wants a quicker process, but apparently Donald Trump does want a long, drawn-out process. He is, at the end of the day, a businessman. He's been on TV before. He knows that he wants to create a show which would work to his advantage, even possibly calling on the whistleblower in this case, in the Ukraine case, as you know, as well as possibly even Hunter Biden, if he were to actually appear before the Senate at this time. What does this do to American society, as I put to all of our guests? It just creates more divisions going into a 2020 election where, as we see in poll after poll, people are polarized and they're stuck in their respective voting bases. So who is this really for? Who is this really gaining from this? Is it rule of law, or is this just partisan politics at its worst? We'll keep a close eye, of course, on this impeachment process going forward here in Scope. I'll be back, though, with my final segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss a collective effort of several top schools coming out of the United States specifically. A lot of them, of course, Ivy League schools, such as Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Stanford, even MIT, where a number of signatories, quite a few of them actually, I should say 400 signatories from those respective schools, have expressed solidarity with a lot of the protesters on the streets of India who are protesting against the Citizenship Amendment Act. In this solidarity that has been expressed by these 400 signatories of their respective open letters, there's talk, of course, about the fact that the act itself is troubling and, of course, does quite obviously target Muslims and excludes Muslims, in fact. But beyond that, just the the response by Indian authorities to these protests that are taking place on university campuses in many cases, as we've seen with the videos that have come out in these weeks, that response is extremely disturbing itself. Now, as we know, Prime Minister Modi himself of India has said that this is all guerrilla politics, in his opinion, and is designed to instigate violence. That's his opinion on this. And he's accused even opposition parties of spreading lies about the Citizenship Act to begin with. Now, as we know, the Citizenship Act gives the chance to many non-Muslims in the region the possibility to get fast-track citizenship in India, but excludes Muslims at this time, at least, even though there has been some talk, of course, about the Supreme Court possibly hearing some of the opposition to that bill and act at this time. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Zaman, who is a journalist with the Voice of America. She's joining us now from Washington, D.C. Joining us from Islamabad is Saeed Ahmed, who is assistant professor at the National Institute of Pakistan Studies at Quaid-e-Azam University. Saeed and Zara, thank you both for your time today. Zara, let me start with you. What do you make of this sort of solidarity expressed by many of these signatories there in the U.S.? It's been received sort of in a mixed fashion within India, where some, I imagine, of course, on the more pro-BJP side have said, listen, you're sitting so many miles away, who are you to talk about our politics? While on the other hand, you have many people saying, listen, this is important solidarity to show.
It was expected in this sense that we're seeing that because of how people are now connected more than ever before through social media, people have been expressing solidarity when it comes to various causes, especially when it comes to young people. Within the United States, we saw that a big movement against gun violence erupted, all because students showed solidarity with each other. So in this case, when something happened on a campus in India, it was something that resonated with students in America, and they came out and gave this statement. One thing that should be noticed, that should be noted in this situation is that it's not the official position of the universities. This is a group of alumni and students who in their individual capacity have expressed solidarity. But it's not surprising, simply because this is something that now resonates with people. The right to protest is something that's enshrined within the U.S. Constitution. It's a very sacred right that people have in the United States. So when students see that in another democracy, students are trying to express themselves and they get baton charged, it's something that gives people an opportunity to show support. And through social media, we see these kind of messages of support more than ever before.
Saeed, what are your thoughts on that? Because this goes to show once again, does it not, that at some level, India really is losing the PR battle on this issue?
Well, yes, I would say, I mean, look at this. The international response has been very critical about what is happening there. And not only internationally, but within India as well. There are, protests in universities, and you can see the voices of Indians, Indian opposition is also criticizing these bills. With the Pakistani side also, Islamabad Foreign Office and our government has criticized it. So there's widespread criticism over these, not only I think this bill, but the national registration, NRC as well. So NRC and CAA both are being criticized on being, this is very communal in their design against Muslims. So, as we can see, India claims that India is a secular state, a democratic state, and both democracy and secularism of India is under, question now. Not only in Pakistan, which is obviously had been critical, but in the world as well. The response, look at the response from UN as well. You must have heard about that India is, there's a threat that, India is, there's a, within India, you can see the voices of even secular parties and left parties are coming up, and people are coming into streets and protesting against this. I think this is also a kind of taste of Indian secularism as well, that the parties who believe in secularism, like National Congress and left-oriented Indian parties, and the people who believe in peace with Pakistan and believe in equality and all that, this is also taste for them as well. So I think we have to see, this is something which we could see, right from Modi's start of 2014 campaign. We could see that this is going on and this was leading towards this. But now what has happened is, after his victory in 2019 elections, the steps which he has taken in Kashmir and then now in Assam, and now this bill, all these things are showing that Modi is getting all the confidence from his electorate, and India is divided on these ideological lines very much now.
Sarah, it has been quite an event if we're completely honest, hasn't it? When it comes to the revocation of Article 370 regarding Kashmir, and then NRC, and then now CAA as well. And then in the United States, we have a president in the White House such as Donald Trump, and he has, in many levels, sided with Narendra Modi, not completely always on the outside, but seemingly their ideologies at the very least align in some fashions, where it's a lot more right-wing, a lot more nationalist, if that's even the correct word to use in this case. Do you think that will change now? Do you think that even the White House may be revisiting how it views such a situation?
See, if you look at what are some of the aspects in which the two leaders, their policies are similar, we see that even in the United States, there has been a massive cut down on how many refugees the U.S. would take. President Trump has continuously been reducing the number of refugees that the U.S. would admit. And for this next year, it has been cut down to a record low of 18,000. So in that case, we see that the U.S. is also cutting down on refugees. India is also tightening its refugee policy. Same thing with immigrants. The Trump administration has been cracking down on illegal immigration. That is what we are also seeing the Narendra Modi government trying to do in India. So in some ways, just like you mentioned, there is similarity in policies. When it comes to a massive change, analysts don't expect a massive change. And that's because India is seen as a major ally in terms of defense, in terms of security, in terms of regional politics in Asia, and particularly also South Asia. It's seen as a counterbalancing force vis-a-vis China. So when it comes to larger issues, that's where America and India see a lot of cooperation with each other. They see each other as partners. So when it comes to domestic policies, it's harder for two allies to change their behavior towards each other based on their respective internal policies. So if the question is that would White House change its views of India, that seems difficult only because the two countries need each other on such a large level that how they operate internally is something that they have also said in statements that they respect each other's ability to run their country how they want. But as we saw, the State Department did release a statement saying that they're watching this with concern. They asked the protesters to follow the law. They also asked the authorities to treat the protesters with respect and manage this crisis as peacefully as possible. So they're paying attention. They're showing concern. State Department is paying attention to this. But any major change in policy would be a surprising factor if it does occur.
So I wonder, Saeed, there's been a lot of talk about the kinds of friends that Narendra Modi keeps, right? So we can talk about A, Donald Trump, and then B, the likes of Israel's Netanyahu, for example. And there's been a lot of talk about how India is now enacting a lot of the sorts of policies that Israel uses throughout the occupied Palestinian territories. Do you also see it that way? Do you think there is almost inspiration that Modi takes from what Israel does to Palestinians about how he then treats his own people, really, in India, or even Kashmiris?
Well, yes, Modi has been, equated with Hitler as well, and of course Netanyahu. You must have seen the statement from, recently about Dr. Gregory Stanton, founder of the Genocide Watch. He also warned that India is moving towards genocide, and he especially mentioned Assam and Kashmir, what is happening there. That it is a stage which is just before the genocide, and the next stage is just the extermination. So obviously these are all these things are there. So I mean, you can see that the policies of Hindutva and the whole the Sangh Parivar and its ideology and all this is interconnected and connected with this bill. And if you look at this whole thing, I think in a way you can connect it to Hitler, you can connect it to Israel, because things are really worse, and people of India are facing it more than anybody else, and especially Muslims, minorities. Other minorities are also facing, I think, and even the left of India is facing this. Congress is facing this. So let's see, how it goes on, because India is India has a society where you have all these voices. So this is, a test case for all these voices as well, that how they survive in this new environment. And what will be the response of the global community as well? Like, we have to look at the UN and United States of America, and obviously people have their economic interests attached with Modi and Modi's India, but human rights and all these issues also feature in, and people protesting. I think this start, which you have mentioned, different universities have students have come out, but if this becomes bigger, and if there is a bigger protest in let's say London, let's say New York or somewhere, that will have a bigger impact. But we have to wait and see if this goes on like that.
All right, so Sarah, I'll give you the final word, if I may. What do you think is and I'm sure you speak to a lot of people, of course, on the ground there in DC. What's the feeling like there amongst, be it experts or just South Asians even, in influential positions, about what direction this is all going in and how troubling all of this is at a human rights level?
Well, overall, what we hear is that there is a concern that India is shifting more and more towards being a right-wing Hindu nationalist state. And for that, we see a lot of analysts speaking here and writers writing for, Washington Post, for New York Times, these opinion pieces that are coming out, not just from actually Washington, D.C., but also from other parts of the world. We've seen even Indian writers write in American newspapers and express concern that their country is shifting towards a troubling, extreme right-wing ideology. So within the U.S., we do see this concern. But the question remains that, would this concern translate into anything concrete? And that is something that, looking at how India and U.S. have managed their relationship, it looks less likely that we would see any major policy shift.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that. But of course, we appreciate both Sarah and Saeed for their time today, and of course, for putting this all into context for us. This collective of alumni and others connected to these very big names in U.S. universities from across that country, such as Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Stanford, that's just a first step, isn't it? As Saeed there said, this sort of movement needs to grow. This is not, of course, the official stances of those respective universities, as Sarah had correctly pointed out, but nevertheless, it's an important first step where you have this sort of solidarity with students who are protesting, are exercising their democratic right, A, and B, protesting against a law and an act which the rest of the world really agrees is very disturbing and does exclude Muslims. I mean, it's right there in plain writing, really. So there's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. But at the same time, you have Narendra Modi then and his arguments about how this is all guerrilla politics, in his opinion, and this is all the opposition instigating further divisions within the country and misstating exactly what the Citizenship Act includes, which for those who have read it, it's all there in plain writing, as I said. We'll keep a close eye on this, of course, because this is an issue which will not die down anytime soon as those protests continue, not only in India, but there are expected to be protests around the world as well on this issue of the CAA, the NRC, and of course, the issue of Kashmir remains in many people's minds as well. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.